As Kurt alluded, these passages were the ones that were picked out by Lois close to 20 years ago in her planning for this day and this hour. Those that know her best are not surprised by her foresight and forethought. And in big letters, when it asks for scripture passages, is 2 Timothy 1, 6 and 7. For this reason, I remind you to rekindle the gift of God that is within you through the laying on of my hands. For God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. Amen. Picture the scene with me. Lois and Jack had together started a church daycare center with a mission to care for families with single mothers. Commonplace today, but an innovative thing in the 1970s. So there's Lois working at this daycare, surrounded by children on the carpet. Now, before this ministry began, some of these children had been in the hands of some interesting babysitters and heard some, interesting words. There on the carpet, then, from time to time, one of these small children would say a word that was, less than appropriate. What would Lois do? Throw up her hands in terror, scream at the child for having a quote, potty mouth, send them off for punishment? No, not Lois. She would gently touch the arm of the child and say with love in her voice, "That's not what we say here." No shame, no panic, just calm correction. It was daughter-in-law Edith, an expert in the area of education, who said that Lois was brilliant in the art of redirection. She had heard stories of Lois as a young mother with her own children. She saw it with her own children, Lois's grandchildren. Again and again, Lois was the master at calm, thoughtful redirection. That's the way we do it here. Edith tells of the time when young Anna was jumping all over the place at nap time, and Lois calmly explained, "We take naps here." A good rule of life, in my opinion. In other words, that's the way we do it here. It's no wonder then that one of her favorite scripture passages comes from this passage in 2 Timothy. If you don't know this book of the Bible, it's a letter written from the Apostle Paul to young Timothy, his protege. The book is filled with examples of advice and direction from a wise master to a young pupil. Again and again we hear Paul say more or less, this is the way we do it here. Paul, and perhaps Lois, were of the personality that Richard Rohr calls the idealist. They had strong values, high-minded goals, an ideal in their mind of behavior and identity. Now, Paul was not always as calm as Lois was, as she managed to be on the carpet with the children. You see, we have some examples of some angry diatribes against certain churches and individuals in them in his letters. Yet, in his writings, especially with Timothy, we see this idealism. This is the way we do it here. The passage that Lois picked as her favorite is from the first chapter of the book. Early on, we see Paul's ideals in place. God has not given us a spirit of fear. That's not the way we do it. But of power, of love, and of self-discipline. We can see why Lois chose this for her favorite passage, can we not? An ideal of the life of God that many of us saw in play over and over again throughout her life. God has given us a spirit of power. That's the way we do it here. Lois's life was one of power, one of empowerment and personal strength. Not only did she and Jack take the courageous step of starting a child care center for single mothers when that was not the norm, but even before that, she was a trailblazer. In the 1950s, she left her home in Pennsylvania to attend school in Indiana. to earn a degree in mathematics, to become an accountant, not a common thing for a woman to do in her era. But she had been empowered by her parents. She and her sister Ruth and her brother John learned early on that God had given them a spirit of power. They had gifts and they had abilities, and they were called to use them. Her children were amazed listening to stories of her in college, jumping on a train with friends, headed from the East Coast to the West, making new friends, hopping around the country with them. It was that power and strength and charisma that no doubt attracted her husband Jack to her. She had become an accountant with Glidden, Cleveland. Again, not necessarily a common sight in those days. And she was singing in the church choir, which was the norm throughout her life. It was a choir Halloween party in which Lois was dressed up with a long black wig and a beautiful costume. Jack took one look at her, saw her confidence and her beauty, and was struck. It wasn't until later that he realized that that wasn't her real hair. But of course, he wasn't just attracted to her hair, but to the charisma, the power within her. No surprise, a few years later they were married, and for 52 years, 3 children, 1,000 adventures together, he always had that twinkle in his eye for that strong and gifted and powerful woman of strength. Paul also reminds Timothy in Lois's favorite verse, God has given us a spirit of self-discipline. That's the way we do it here. Now, is anyone surprised that this passage is one of her favorites? Hers was a life of self-discipline. In some ways, she fit the stereotype of an accountant, measured, thorough, thoughtful. Just like Paul, the idealist, hers was a life of working to strive for high ideals. Her children remember their growing up years, begun in Cleveland with Eric, Kurt a few years later in St. Louis, Karen a few after that in Overland Park, who remembered her as one who, never made a show of discipline, but always made it clear that they were to be responsible, they were to be thoughtful as well. In other words, saying, this is the way we do it here. When they were teenagers, the boys would work at the local swimming pool, even when they were a bit on the young side. When the manager called the house looking for a worker, Lois always told him, they'll be right there. Whether they were in the kitchen working on their homework or across the neighborhood with friends, she'd have them in the car and on their way to the pool within a few minutes. There they would work their shift. There they would keep their responsibilities. But that discipline that she asked of her children was not just a rule for them. She had the same self-discipline, for she would find out when their break was going to be at the pool. And as soon as they walked into the break room, Lois would enter the other door with a tinfoil wrapped piping hot meal for them to eat on break. She was always there, always on the minute, on time. Hers was a life of self-discipline, intentional care for those in her world. Which brings us to Paul's last reminder for Timothy. God has given us a spirit of love. For that is the way we do it.